Today I'm turning one of my favorite concept art buildings by the artist Zyk0 C into a modular miniature model. Just like my last foray into terrain building, I'm making use of this thick 1.3mm cardstock that I can print on with my home printer. Unlike last time, however, I'm not limiting myself to constructing it using only the cardstock itself. This time around, I'll be making use of both glue and magnets that will allow me to snap the individual floors of my building into place. You see, I want a crisp and clean model that my miniatures can explore level by level. Working with the cardstock clips was an interesting experiment for my last project, but it did have quite the impact on both the look and usability of the terrain itself. This actually also plays part in the reason why I've decided to turn to a piece of concept art by another artist instead of designing my own for this project. On one end, I wanted to be able to focus on the construction itself, using some techniques I hadn't experimented with before, and on the other end, I see it as an homage to some of my favorite inspirations. Build this in your own style project. For those of you who'd like to join me, I'm adding a link to my print sheets in the description below, and I'll also add links to all the specific tools I use to craft it. This time around, I've also added Photoshop files so you can make custom adjustments based on the material you want to use for this build. I'll add a little addendum at the end of the video to show you how that's done. But for now, let's get to crafting. After we've printed out all the art, I get to cutting them up one by one. I generally start by following the cut markers I set for the floors of each building first, to make sure those don't get lost in the process. This cardstock paper is pretty thick, so it takes some time to get through it all. I've actually found the laser cutter Nerdforge uses on their channel, which could be an interesting purchase if I do end up making more of these in the future. It's pretty expensive, but would definitely be worth it if I do end up exploring all the other ideas I have for this style of terrain building. Another nifty purchase might be a finger protector for cutting these out if I don't end up getting a tool for it, because these knives are really freaking sharp. Getting out each piece, I make sure to group them together for when I start gluing the sections. You can use the print sheets of the original design to keep track of the pieces as well, but it does save time to do it now. Once you've cut up all the sheets, I make sure to test the glue I bought for this project. I already had a similar glue from a similar brand, but I wanted to try and find a miniature-friendly version of it, one that I had hoped would give me pinpoint precision. But after testing it out, it seemed my old one was better at getting the job done, even if it meant I'd be spilling a lot more glue while building this model. When you see me rubbing my fingers together at any point during the gluing process, that's me trying to get the excess glue off my fingers. Now, I'm learning as I go here, figuring out what the best technique is to assemble these pieces. It does seem, speaking with hindsight here, that the best technique is to always start by gluing together two wall sections first, and then adding in a floor piece third. Unlike last time, where I used the clips to assemble my buildings, using glue to do the same thing takes a bit more precision. There's a couple of major boons to working with glue on something like this though. For one, you can go a lot smaller in the places that are being assembled. Creating an arch like I'm doing here would not be possible with the clipping technique. What's also excellent when working with glue is that you can take your time placing the parts at the right angle as it's slowly solidifying. Working with something like the rooftop of my arch here, I have to make sure that the roof is lined up with the back wall on one end and only sticks out on the other end. That wall end will later be placed against the main building, and if the rooftop is sticking out too much, it won't fit neatly against the wall there. After I've tested out the glue for this first bit of assembly, I get to the main buildings next. Before I do so, however, I have to make sure that all the doors are opened up. I don't want to accidentally glue them shut with the rest of the walls. Doors are pretty straightforward to get right. Just cut out all the way on both ends that open outwards, and make sure you make a slight incision on the end with the hinges. Depending on where you want the door to open up, in this case it'll always be the outside, unless you cut a part of the bottom of the door so it can open up to the inside. I've planned on doing some interior designs in the future as well, and those doors will probably need a section of the bottom cut out. And what's important when we get to assembling our building is that we make sure sure we understand how the design is structured. You see, there are two types of wall sections. On one end, you have walls that are the exact same length as the floor plate that you're supposed to be glued on. And on the other end, we have wall sections that are longer. Those sections stick out so that when you glue a short section on top of it, the floor plate would fit in neatly right in between. It's a pretty easy rule of thumb to follow, especially once you understand that all the long pieces run in one direction and all the short pieces run in a perpendicular direction to them. I'll generally also stick to the rule of using long pieces on the front-facing side of my buildings so that the art is uninterrupted. It's the same reason why the floor plates are glued on the inside of the design and not on top, making sure that the art between each floor of your building remains intact. If I were to glue it on top, you'd see the edge of the floor plate running in between each floor instead. When I first got started on the walls of our flower shop here, I experimented a bit with attaching the wall section on the floor plate first. It's pretty obvious this was a bad way to go about it, but I wanted to try out a couple of techniques so I'd be able to share what worked best for me. Afterwards, I mainly got back to the technique of attaching two wall sections first before gluing them onto the floor. Once all the walls of our flower shop are in place, I get to the walkway in between that connects the two buildings of our ground floor. This piece requires a special bit of attention as it features an archway that we need to curve before we can get to glue it into place. It's a pretty simple trick, same as we did with the doors, to create a little incision running all the way along the curve of our arch. You can actually follow the lines of the brickwork and just cut along them. I originally made these cuts every 2 layers of bricks, but I got the best results of going all the way up to every 1 layer, so between each line of the brickwork. Once the curve has been made, we can apply glue and set it on top of our archway. You can take your time adjusting it as the glue hardens. There's room for error here, especially on the ceiling of our arch, which is fairly obscured by the wall on the outside anyway. In this design, I decided to isolate the archway, building walls and small rooftop on top of it. This choice doesn't just help me conceal the cut lines on top of the tunnel, but it also makes it so that both the guardhouse and the flower shop are marked off by a straight piece of wall on the grid. One of my favorite pieces of this build is the overhang on the front door of the flower shop. It's such a simple piece, but it adds so much character to the design. What I've learned from building these is that you want to add as many layers and dimensions to a design as you can. What you lose in the texturing of your walls in comparison to resin printed models is regained by adding in lots of little details like these. Once we get to the rooftops, I make sure to hold off on attaching the floor plate itself before I get a chance to place my magnets in there. Now, as you'll notice, I did make a design error when it came to printing my main roof here, having miscalculated the placement of my tower. Luckily, I had some leftover pieces of another section of my roof, and I was able to patch it up neatly. As I was building this during the holiday season and having run out of cardstock, I would have had to wait weeks for a new batch. So I thought this would be a better way to go about it, instead of holding off on the build for that long. Either way, it's also an excellent example of rolling with the punches when you're designing or illustrating something. It ended up actually adding in a bit of character to the building in its own way. One of the best parts of building a piece of terrain like this is mapping out your process, figuring out solutions to problems at hand, and then making sure if the ideas in your head come to reality even exist. When I was working with the clipping system, it was really difficult to find a plastic version without having to design and print one myself. Making the move to magnets, however, I knew that there would be so many options readily available to me. Having found these little 5mm magnetic cubes, I had found a perfect fit for what I had in mind. Next came the designing phase, where I would stick these magnets into the cardstock design I had made before, to figure out if the glue would keep these magnets into place and to see how strong these magnets actually work. You can imagine I was pretty stoked to see that it actually worked like a charm. Now, the way I set it up was that each level of my building would have magnets on the ground level that could connect to magnets near the ceiling of the level below it. The magnets on the ground floor would be no problem as they're being pulled towards the floor floor plate, but the magnets at the top corner obviously didn't have anything to obstruct them. That's where these little wooden squares come into the picture for those who are actually building along with me. By gluing them on top of the magnets and by gluing them into the top corner of my walls, I could reinforce the placement of the magnets and make them blend in with the artwork. Once all the magnets for my rooftop were in place, I could finally glue the rooftop on top, sealing them inside. For the cherry on top of my design, I really wanted to add all those little decorative pieces like the shutters for the windows. The only issue was I needed to make sure I cut the cardstock at the right angle to make them look right. So I started out with a little couple of test pieces, making sure that I could get the right results I was looking for. Having spent quite some time on this entire construction, I didn't want to mess it up by doing something untested. I gotta say, I really love how this model turned out. In my opinion, it's a huge step forward in comparison to the previous design, but it obviously depends on what you're building it for. I think if I were to mass produce the last one, people would be more inclined to test it out, as it just requires you to clip the walls into place, while this one requires a lot more crafting before it's finished, even if I were to provide the punch cards for a building like this. Anyway, I do want to try my hands on a lot more projects like these. I hope you like them too, and if you do, be sure to like and subscribe. That's it for this video. See you next time. I decided to add this little addendum at the end of the video as it felt a bit out of place in the beginning and might not even be useful for most people who are watching me. If you're looking into building this project with another type of material than I used in the video, the way it works is you simply locate the floor plate file and adjust the print lines to fit the material you're using where you will print or glue the art on top of. My cardstock, as I've mentioned before, is 1.3 millimeters thick, so all the lines match up to that scale. Make sure to measure the material you're using and then adjust the lines for the floor plates accordingly. All my horizontal lines are placed on the outside of the floor plate. You can put guides on the inch markers to find the exact spot, and all the vertical lines on the inside. This takes into account the area where one wall is glued on top of another. What we're basically doing is cutting off a section of the floor plate before it's printed so that it can slide inside of the frame of our walls. Placing the floor plates inside of the walls guarantees that all the floors fit neatly on top of each other, preserving all the artwork we've made. Once you've adjusted all the files, simply replace the original floor plates I added to the print file with the adjusted ones you just made, and now you can get to printing and joining me in chapter 2 of this video.